This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Patrick Deneen his latest book, Why Liberalism Failed. Patrick Deneen is the David A. Potenziani Memorial Associate Professor of Constitutional Studies. He's the author and editor of over half a dozen books. He appeared on Liberty Law Talk over a year ago to discuss conserving America. He's also the author of Democratic Faith, which was published in 2005, and he has a number of interesting book projects in the works, from what I can tell. Patrick, welcome to the program. Congratulations on the success of Why Liberalism Failed. We were talking before we started recording that the book is doing really well in terms of sales, and of course, to get a book to read, to interview you, one of our mutual friends had to actually mail me his copy. So I guess if we're writing books, we need to take advice from you on how to be a successful marketer.
Well, thanks very much, Richard. And all I can say is that maybe the title and the book has something to do with it, but I think it's all timing.
Yeah. So why? No, that's an interesting question. Why is a book heavy philosophical analysis, somewhat critical of America at times, is flying off the shelves?
Well, I think it's we're obviously in a moment when people are looking for explanations of what they see as a kind of crisis of the American political and broadly more broadly the social and even economic order. What's interesting too is that I've been getting a lot of interview requests and even invitations in Europe and in Australia. So this is a kind of widespread kind of time of anxiety about Western liberal democracy more broadly. So it's not simply an American phenomenon.
Yes.
It's really widespread. And I do think people are in the kind of usual explanation that might be partisan or talk about at the level of kind of daily operational politics doesn't seem to really address what people, I think, perceive as a kind of deeper crisis of Western liberal democracy. And so my book just wasn't written for this moment necessarily, but it just hit a moment where it certainly has received attention far beyond what I would have anticipated.
Yeah, and you mentioned partisan. You are critical of both what we might think of as contemporary conservatism and also progressive liberalism in your analysis of where we are. Maybe taking a cue from the title of your book, Why Liberalism Failed. I want to ask you, what is liberalism, and why and how did it fail?
Well, sure. Obviously, it's a contested term, like any great capacious term in political philosophy. I point to and I focus on really kind of two main aspects of liberalism as a political philosophy, and I think certainly one could debate about my selection of those foci. But I do think if we sort of distilled kind of what are its core features, I would point especially to the vision I think embodied in broadly speaking liberalism, the project that begins centuries ago in early modern thinking. The vision of the human being, of course, initially portrayed in kind of state of nature theories, but I think also articulated in thinkers as diverse as John Stuart Mill and John Dewey and so forth. The vision of a human being who is in some ways defined by the liberty to choose without obstacle, certainly without any obstacle that can be in some ways treated or dislodged or overcome, to in a sense choose a life path and a life plan, and in some ways a conception of even self that's defined as in the context of an absence of those kinds of obstacles. So an example would be overcoming the old aristocratic order in which you could say our identity was defined by who we came from or where we happened to be born, or what the profession of our father was. Think of a name like Smith or Weaver or Cooper, right? Those great old Anglo-Saxon names. That wasn't just a coincidental name. It actually defined who you were and what your profession was. So I see it at a core level of creating a world that allows for the greatest possibility of this kind of self-definition. And this takes two primary forms. The first is through, we could say broadly, political, economic, and social forms, and that's in some ways you could say political liberalism and the creation of a society. And this is in some ways the classical liberal vision, the society that seeks to secure individual rights of life, liberty, and property. But then gets transformed as well as progressive liberalism, which is the kind of seeing increasingly the need for far greater activity by the state to help people secure the actual conditions of that form of equal liberty. And the second dimension is the obstacles that are placed on this form of liberty by, we could say broadly speaking, by nature. And the natural world. And this can be understood as sort of nature out there, the kind of the forces of nature that prevent our free enjoyment of this kind of form of self-definition, but also increasingly human nature, biological nature, and the need to conquer the limitations of biological nature, where a lot of our contemporary political debates have landed in the kind of effort through science and technology to extend the mastery of nature into the human body itself. So that's really the core feature of what I regard as the basic devotions of the liberal order. And I suggest that it has failed, not because it has in some ways failed to live up to this ambition, but because it is increasingly being successful in achieving this end and this vision of human life, which turns out in many ways to be catastrophic for human life.
Yeah. I want to read from your introduction, page 3, and maybe you can elaborate more. Very, very powerfully worded. As there are many very powerful paragraphs and arguments in the book. You say, liberalism has failed, not because it fell short, but because it was true to itself. It has failed because it has succeeded. As liberalism has become more fully itself, as its inner logic has become more evident and its self-contradictions manifest, it has generated pathologies that are at once deformations of its claims, yet realizations of liberal ideology, a political philosophy launched to foster greater equity, defend a pluralist tapestry of different cultures and beliefs, protect human dignity, and of course expand liberty in practice generates titanic inequality, enforces uniformity, homogeneity, fosters material and spiritual degradation, and undermines freedom. Maybe we can unpack that just a little bit. So one thing that a question for you is, how thin or how thick does liberalism have to be? Because as I think about why liberalism failed, on one level I very much agree with you. On another level I don't. And I guess I suppose I see a constitutional liberalism providing procedural protections for individuals that are incredibly important. And I think that's a very thin conception of liberalism. But I think that's, in large measure, something worth defending. And then there's this thicker conception you talk about, and maybe talk about some of these consequences you mentioned in this paragraph too, which sound very horrific and would lead us all, I think, to turn away from liberalism.
Right. Yeah. No. In some ways, I'm really I'm taking on a long-standing view, which I think is true of both in some ways the left and the right, of what you call a kind of thin conception of liberalism. That it's, as you put it, procedural. It sets up sort of the rules of the game, and then allows for kind of the full expanse of forms of liberty, which can include, for example, illiberal forms of life. I mean, a couple of times in the book I give examples from the Amish as a kind of counterexample to the liberal, sort of the ideal human life or person envisioned in kind of liberal ideology. And one could simply say, well, the fact that the Amish are allowed to live and flourish in American society, doesn't that prove that, in fact, liberalism can, in fact, be this thin conception? And obviously my argument is that, or what should be obvious from reading the book, is that, in fact, far from being a kind of thin, neutral rules of the game, the effort to create the conditions, and indeed the kind of titanic architecture that's needed to create the conditions for the realization of this autonomous, free, self-making individual, actually requires the kind of creation of a kind of comprehensive transformation of society, in all of its respects. And this is why the book not only treats, of course, politics, but treats things like education, technology, culture, and so forth. That I see this liberal order not just as a political system, but really as a comprehensive order. And this obviously runs very much against the view of liberalism as a minimalist or as a thin procedural form of life or political ordering. And I think at base you have a kind of a conception of a human anthropology that underlies individualism and that animates many of its sort of main devotions, and therefore a kind of outworking of a kind of logic within the organization of society. And why, for example, regardless of which political party, in a sense, is in power in any particular time, there's kind of like a ratchet wrench effect that advances the part of that party's agenda that conforms more deeply to the grain of the regime, which is the liberation of the individual self. And so, regardless of all the years that Republicans have been in power talking about family values, what we've seen is a kind of a devastation in the realm of family values, particularly among those who are least well off among us, while advancing the globalized economic system. That's also part of the right agenda in America. And on the left, we've seen arguments for the need for a moralized economy, constraining the economy and its globalized form, at least among some people on the left. But what we've really seen advanced is the liberationist project of the sexual revolution, which has been the most successful part of the left's agenda and increasingly becomes, seems like almost the sole part of the left's agenda. So I think the comprehensiveness in some ways of liberal doctrine is manifest not just politically, but of course socially, culturally, educationally, and otherwise. And I think ultimately sort of puts to I think contradicts the view of that liberalism is simply a thin, procedural, political form of a sort of modus vivendi, using John Rawls's term. And really constitutes kind of its own comprehensive doctrine.
Yeah, no, and I upon thinking about John Rawls, one always, as I say to myself, he has his own comprehensive doctrine. Quite clearly in the terms of how he thinks about human beings and what he thinks actually the good should be pursued by a liberal order. But I wanted to, as I read your book, I found myself nodding along a lot and agreeing with you. But I guess
that's better than nodding off a lot.
I nodding along, yes, not nodding off. No, I don't think anyone's going to nod off reading your book. But as I read it, I agreed, and yet I had this nagging sense that I did not agree with you. But and articulating that, trying to articulate that here is, I wonder, why is liberalism, though, the sort of generator of so much distress and problems? And I guess I thought of two texts. One, which I'm sure you're familiar with. I'm sure you're familiar with both Leo Strauss, The Three Ways of Modernity, and that analysis. And because I think a lot of where you begin is sort of his first wave of modernity, which is Hobbes, Locke, Machiavelli preceding Hobbes. And then, and I was thinking also shorter text, Pope Benedict XVI's Regensburg Address. And I thought about those two, I thought, why is it not the evisceration of reason that's the problem? Not liberalism. Liberalism is just working out the political consequences of this deformation of human reason and the closing off of our ability to think that we can investigate the full human things, the permanent things, the good itself, which I think is regnant within the modern West, and it has all sorts of consequences, which we're dealing with. Some of which we're dealing with right now in a very immediate sense. You can in effect discard your own biology and choose your gender.
Well, yeah, no, and I'll admit a kind of division of labor here, which I would be the first to acknowledge that I think what I'm regarding as the crisis of the West is much more deeply a kind of metaphysical and ontological crisis, or it derives from metaphysical and ontological sources, and maybe most deeply theological, a kind of theological crisis as well. And that we could say that this has many different manifestations, and one of these manifestations is in politics. And so my analysis is, in some ways, it may be simply an analysis of a particular symptom of this deeper problem of metaphysical, ontological, theological. But this is my particular wheelhouse, which is the study of political philosophy. So this is, in some ways, in a way, because you could say, because one of the consequences of, I would say broadly, the liberal order is that it places so much emphasis ultimately on seeing life through a political lens, and seeing the success of our political life through the achievement of certain kinds of political ends. Particularly this realization of this human type, this liberated, autonomous individual, that we become to see the world in almost completely political terms. And I think this helps to explain some of the madness of our society today when it comes to questions of politics. Politics was never and can never bear the weight and the pressure and the expectations that we're placing upon it today, and why there's a kind of mania today when thinking about politics. But you could say then that politics is now a kind of an entry into what can be far deeper conversations, right? And I would agree with you completely. And I would hope that in some ways my book would be an invitation for people, once they've digested it, to begin to think of what are the even deeper sources of this crisis. And so I would agree with you completely, but in some ways to start with a metaphysical question, to put that on the plate first, people will look at it and say, I don't understand what that is. And so in a way, it's a kind of, it begins at a much more familiar level.
Yeah,
I think for your average reader, and can be a point of entry into something I hope far more, far deeper and far more profound.
What as I asked you that question, I was thinking about, Pope Benedict gave these lectures on these addresses, I should say, on the natural law and relating that to the positive law in the British House of Commons, or was it Westminster Palace, the Bundestag, and I think also he spoke in France on this, but he never turns away from liberal democracy. What he emphasizes is reason, and believing that reason is open both to revelation and also to the good, and through that we can enter into a better discussion of what our democracies should do, what they should be about. Also thinking about John Courtney Murray, and his, and I can't reproduce it, but it's sort of, if we lose our confidence in the ability of reason to understand the human things, nature, man, and the truths of the American constitutional order, then it's eviscerated at one stroke. But again, I guess I emphasize that to you because it seems to me they're not turning away from liberalism. They actually think liberalism is the best way to get there, to understand the truth, precisely because it allows the human soul that freedom to pursue these questions in a way in which couldn't be true if our conscience and if our inquiry process is threatened either by sort of a rational constructivist ideology, like certain forms of progressivism, or superstition or bigotry.
Right. Well, I would say I would certainly agree that in the case of Benedict XVI, I think John Courtney Murray sometimes can be a little bit slippery and difficult to pin down in this question, but they never turn their back on liberty, I would say, and the essential importance of liberty, precisely in orienting one properly toward the truth and through reason toward the truth, and that this encounter can't be forced, it can't be contrived. But the argument in my book is that this thing that I'm describing as liberalism, this really an ideology, in fact, ultimately is a contradiction of, and indeed is the elimination of, I think, a certain conception of liberty that would underlie someone like Benedict's or John Paul II's understanding of precisely the kind of freedom that's the essence of this reason and rational pursuit and effort to understand the truth. I think the deepest irony that I really try to draw out in the book is how this political philosophy aimed at liberating the human being, you talk about constructivist, I would say kind of based upon a false anthropology, actually ends up in a kind of ironic and paradoxical way enslaving us in that very classical sense to the lower part of our nature, to the desires and the passions, and to the appetites, but also enslaves us in a kind of, I think, a way that Benedict draws out in a number of his sermons and lectures, enslaves us to the tools that are supposed to liberate us: the technological, scientific order, the state that comes into existence to assist us to realize our liberty, the economic system, the globalized economic system that we create in order to achieve full economic liberty, that when we speak of all of these aspects of our lives increasingly, we see these as forces that are uncontrollable and that dictate us, that these are dehumanizing tools, in a sense, that have in a way escaped our own control. So I think that it's quite right and quite proper to say that liberty is at the essence of this relationship of reason to truth. But I would contest that at least what I really have come to understand as the liberal order itself is a contradiction of this form of liberty.
Now, and I guess, so my question to you, because I'm thinking about within the family of thought of liberalism, or the families of thought, you don't make a separation between classical liberalism, which, I've always been taught and tend to believe is a good thing, particularly here at Liberty Fund, and modern liberalism. And you say there's really no principled separation between these two conceptions of liberalism. Talk about that.
Well, I mean, of course, there are really important differences between classical liberalism. Again, we could look at figures like Locke, Adam Smith, and so forth, and progressive liberalism, the introduction of the historicist understanding of human beings. Human beings don't have a fixed nature, that we develop in and through time, and that time itself has a kind of a trajectory, and that trajectory tends to be sort of upward toward progress, toward greater liberation, toward greater control of our circumstances and nature, and so forth. And while I think there are extremely important, really, really important differences between these two worldviews, I would say nevertheless that they are within the same family of belief, and that there's a kind of deep relationship between the two. In a sense, with both of them having as an object or an aim the equal liberty of all human beings, the debate tends to become increasingly over means, whether that the means to achieving that is best understood to be the sort of minimal state of classical liberalism that supports, in particular, free markets and free decisions of individuals, or whether the means becomes increasingly the state as the kind of vehicle toward increasingly providing support for the realization of the equal liberty of all human beings. But that, in effect, in one chapter of the book really talks about that the growth of individualism as such and the growth of the state are not contradictions. They actually end up being mutually reinforcing. And so while we tend to fight these titanic battles on the level of contemporary politics between the left and the right, what we see is a kind of ratchet wrench movement in which the liberation of the individual from families, from communities, from places, from history, from nature, and so forth, and the growth of the state increase simultaneously, that they grow together. And I think in this regard, you can see the underlying commitments of liberalism in both of its forms manifest in this way. So I don't want to deny that there are not important differences, but nevertheless, I think that there's a kind of deeper continuity, and there's a reason why these are both called liberal, oddly enough, or both called a form of liberalism.
Trying to account for this. So if we just look at a thinker like Robert Nisbet, who would agree with a lot of what you articulate about the relationship, but which I tend to agree with, the relationship between autonomy and also collectivism being sort of a dialectical working out of each other. But it seems to me, is it the case that classical liberalism theoretically cuts us off from nature, such that we couldn't have a discussion about our relation? It does not predicate or depend upon a relational personhood and sort of the robustness of that in all of its dimensions: economic, civil society, familial, religious. I guess I'm having a hard time seeing that part of it. What I can see though is the power of modern progressivism, the sort of corruption of our thought that historicism, positivism brings. I see all of that in sort of this almost irresistible pool too of economic growth and economic growth happening in certain ways, technology happening in certain ways, and that seems to be the thing that we slowly have oriented ourselves towards. But I don't know. I guess I have a hard time understanding how that would build from classical liberalism simply.
Well, yeah. Well, I guess I'll provide something of an example, which I think one of the core commitments and core arguments of classical liberalism is in some ways to redefine the human relationship to nature. On the one hand, classical liberalism does posit that there is a human nature. Our nature is understood if we conceive of human beings in the state of nature. That's how we see what human nature is. But on the other hand, it conceives of human beings as in some ways apart from the natural world, and that the natural world is in fact increasingly seen as something that can be subject to our nature, that our nature, particularly as rights-bearing individuals who seek the realization of our liberty, requires us to engage in the project, particularly the project of modern science, in order to bring nature to heal, in order to support our benefit and our liberty and our comfort, the increase and prosperity that's so much a part of the modern liberal project. So that the natural world is really reconceived, if you think about it, compare it to its Aristotelian or Thomistic understanding of a continuity, really, between the world of nature and human nature, that there is no differentiation between these two. I think in the root of this kind of differentiation between a kind of human nature and the natural world, you could see how this would transmute, among other things, in the progressive liberal time. Now, early progressive liberalism is very similar in its regard of nature as subject to our conquest and mastery. The language of Bacon is adopted wholesale by John Dewey. John Dewey calls Francis Bacon the greatest philosopher in the history of humankind. But that you could say what progressivism really, where it goes, is the extension of this idea to human nature itself, that human nature is subject to our own mastery, oddly enough. I'm not sure who's doing the mastering at this point, since we ourselves are the ones who are manipulating our own nature. But the basic idea is that nature is itself this substance for our control and our mastery, and whether it's the nature out there in the world or the nature, you could say the human nature itself, there's a kind of deep continuity in this respect between classical liberalism and progressive liberalism.
What do we do, thinking about certain key thinkers? In my own development, Lord Acton. I think I mentioned one of them, John Courtney Murray. Less well-known, obviously, one you and I know really well, Orestes Bronson. But also think about Abraham Lincoln and some of his rhetoric. He seems to be fully connecting up a liberal free order with nature. And all of these thinkers do that. And so what do you know that they didn't know?
Well, at least putting Lincoln aside for a second, I think it's a little bit more complicated. Some of his writings, I think, do share very much the view of the more Baconian view of nature.
Certainly the way he writes about human freedom. And we can put aside just the constitutional arguments for it, but certainly the way he writes about human freedom, it's a natural right analysis that I think is fully conversant with the good, and same for the other thinkers that I'm citing. But I think, and I don't want to keep going back in circles here, but it seems to me, liberalism is the unlocking of that. It's the best way to actually, in an incredibly diverse modern setting, it's the best way.
Well, what I was going to say about, I think, Acton and Murray and Brownson is you have here three thinkers who are Catholic, at least Brownson, who converts to Catholicism, for whom I think when they're thinking of this liberal project, in some ways think about it differently than many of its architects. I think precisely because they're bringing a much more of a Catholic worldview to their analysis of this order. And in this sense, you could say maybe this is the corrective that's needed. Maybe there is a kind of Catholic corrective that's needed. I would say increasingly that what I see happening is that Catholic thinking and many contemporary Catholics have very much accommodated themselves to the liberal order and are offering less a corrective than a kind of accommodation to its general conceptions. I think in particular about the ways, especially in the 1980s, that many Catholic thinkers really embraced pretty wholesale the idea of the contemporary capitalist market as the greatest vehicle of human liberation, and this very much comports with one of the main projects and tools of the liberal order in its effort to liberate human beings from to this condition of autonomy. One can understand that, especially in the context of a battle against communism. It's completely understandable in a kind of context in which that takes place. But this seems to me to be ultimately a kind of accommodation to the liberal order that departed from a long-standing Catholic understanding that neither capitalism nor communism was this kind of appropriate way to think about the nature of human liberty in economic affairs. So I think I can understand how it's interesting how you return to thinkers who are often informed by a more Catholic, and I would say for that reason a more classical understanding, as opposed to a purely liberal, modern Enlightenment liberal understanding.
No, I mean as I think about your book, and I think about liberalism, and I'm trying to think, did liberalism fail? And it seems to me what really happened is we cut off a huge part of our tradition.
Right.
But that's a modern thing.
So it seems to me that one of the bones of our contention here was that sort of
faded.
Was it contingent or necessary? Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Was it something that can be in some ways recovered within the liberal order itself, or does it arise naturally and almost inevitably from within the logic of liberalism? And I obviously hold to the latter position. That it seems to me it's within the very logic of the liberal anthropology and the liberal political and economic and cultural and technological project that inheritance was going to be cut off. And in fact, I would say more than that it actually sort of draws down those resources until it depletes them. And then it can't be rebuilt at all because they're just sort of gone.
So where does this leave America? The founding of America, within firmly this liberal process of drawing down of resources, or is there, or are there a lot of resources in the American founding? One of which I would grant you, I think there is this potentiality in the American founding, but there's a lot of other resources working as well.
Well, I guess one thing my book attempts to do is to say maybe we need to move beyond founderism. I guess I don't say that sort of quite explicitly, but in other words, that the unfolding, if I can put it that way, the unfolding logic within liberalism has made any idea of recovering what I think was, what Brownson describes as a kind of mixed founding, right?
Yeah.
Brownson acknowledges, yes, there were these very Enlightenment-derived, highly, very much within the ambit of what I'm describing as liberalism, that this was very much a part of the official founding. In fact, he says this was the official founding, but that the founding fathers, or even more broadly, the people living in this time period, had a very close, proximity to and ability to draw upon a much older tradition, reaching back, into the medieval and classical period, that was still, in a sense, a living, flowing stream into this otherwise official Enlightenment philosophy. And as we've sort of used up the water of that stream and it's dried up, now what we see manifesting itself is the sort of the liberal order itself coming into full flourishing. So I think that what you're suggesting is we can just kind of sort of uncork those waters and let them flow back in again. And my suspicion, again, I don't want to say categorically it's not possible, but my suspicion is that once that's dried up, once we've drawn down on that set of resources, it can't simply just be recreated ex nihilo in a sense, or expected to be just sort of there for our availability. If we're going to, in a sense, go forward, we have to think about going forward. And so oddly enough, while I'm often accused of being some kind of nostalgist, I actually think there's a need for thinking and developing practices that can, in a sense, build anew without proposing some kind of either return or proposing some kind of wholesale replacement, which I think would be catastrophic.
No.
So I tend to think of more local solutions as at least the start of an effort of building something out of what I think is the kind of depleted condition and this flattened condition in which we now live.
No, I don't want to refight the American founding with you. And you've been having a lot of interesting discussions with certain thinkers on that. But I've, 2 points. One, you don't take the Bronson position, I don't think. It really is a highly problematic founding in your argument. Bronson would argue that actually, though, there is something unwritten about America. There is sort of the opportunity present within the resources of the founding of the full scope of the Western tradition. And he gives examples and ways in which we sort of realize that without talking about it. And so we actually have this practice of Republican liberty in America that we draw on. I think there's anything we can uncork and sort of the waters are renewed and we're rejuvenated and we experience ourselves anew. What I do think, though, is in many respects, I don't know that things are that categorically different from the ways in which they've been throughout our country. There's an ongoing argument between, as Tocqueville would describes it early in Democracy in America, they're the Virginians. He equates them basically with pirates. And they're the Puritans of Massachusetts. And I think, obviously things change and evolve, but in a way in which I think we're still sort of having a lot of those similar types of discussions between a very individualistic case, but also a case of American freedom that is rooted in virtue, that is accessible to us best when we keep, ourselves in front of God or keep ourselves under God. And that this sort of debate over liberty and responsibility continues to go on in our country. The debates change, but there's still a lot of that same thing happening. It seems to me the big intervention has really been the liberal philosophers on the court, for whom it's very hard to reverse and challenge those decisions. But it seems that in a way this process is still open to us, but we've got to keep making the arguments and we've got to keep thinking about what's best about our country.
Yeah, actually, I agree with really much of what you said there. I suppose I would just my own reading is that it's to put a finer point on it. That in a way, what you're describing as this kind of almost this tradition, where you call kind of Republican liberty, is in many ways draws on, and here I'll agree with Brownson, draws on a longer. Much longer and deeper tradition, but that in some ways the official philosophy of America, and what I would regard as the founding philosophy of America, has worked at cross purposes with this kind of, you could say, this more practical inheritance. And so it's one of the things that I see sort of dissipating and being drawn down is the kind of the practices that in some ways allowed for the sustenance of the and in some ways the success of a liberal philosophy that didn't have the substance to sustain it, right? The civic and religious and moral resources to sustain it. And as the liberal project, its official iteration, has been more successful, it has drawn down and in many ways eviscerated that kind of inheritance. And so one of my arguments is that we have to think of this less as a project of recovering the political philosophy of the American founding, or the to recover some conception of liberalism that will save us, and really think about the practices that need to be in some ways regenerated. And those practices are not going to be created in Washington, D.C., and they're not going to be won or achieved by the Supreme Court, and they're not going to be extended or strengthened by electoral victories. And this is not to say there aren't very important things at stake in any of these kinds of decisions. But from my experience, for many years living and participating in a kind of conservative set of discussions and debates, the focus has come to be almost exclusively on the political battles that need to be fought and won. And it really does seem to me that this is in some ways almost like throwing a can of gasoline on a fire that's already raging, that the understanding of what our condition is needs to run far deeper, and as a result, how we think about any sense of building from here is going to actually be much more difficult than I think the focus on the political project allows us, and I think in some ways deceives us, lulls us into thinking is the case.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, and I think a practical solution is we want to keep a lot of institutions free. to allow sort of a competitive process to emerge. So we want to protect homeschooling. We want to support I think this rising classical schooling movement. We want to ensure that institutions like Notre Dame can offer the health care they want, and we want to actually see this
the right kind of health care, right?
Well, and it's what
Yeah.
it's what the late Peter Lawler talked about: libertarian means for non-libertarian ends. We want to see that process work out and play itself out, because it over time, and maybe this is the best part of sort of the founding architecture, is separation of powers and federalism. The best practice could be it allows us to see the good through the delay and through preventing sort of a rush to some sort of judgment on what everyone must do.
Yeah, and so it's been interesting. I've been having some discussions with the publication of the book with a number of philanthropic organizations. They give advice to philanthropists about where they should devote their giving. And one of the things that I find kind of exciting is that there seems to be a new openness to thinking that while it's important to donate to various causes that focus on affairs in Washington, D.C., there seems to be a really growing interest in saying, what can we do at the level, far more local level, to support the cultivation of the kinds of sort of human characters and the kind of lives that is going to be much more generational. It doesn't think in electoral terms. It doesn't think in 2 or 4 year cycles, but it thinks generationally. And this, to me, if there's anything that should be definitionally conservative, it's the capacity to think generationally, to think of ourselves as part of a long narrative and a story that unfolds over a long period of time, and that such giving is really a form of a kind of investment for the long term. And I find this to be exciting, that I do think that there's a growing awareness among many in the United States that I guess the old phrase is sort of politics is downstream from culture. Mm-hmm. It's not to minimize the importance of politics, and as you brightly put it, in an ideological system in which I think we now increasingly live, it's important to fight those battles to preserve spaces of liberty and spaces of freedom. But let's face it, people have lived under ideologies before, and they had a lot less freedom than we do, and had very robust forms of religious life. I think of John Paul II, Karl Wojtyla, and the sort of secret churches in Poland. I think in some ways, if we have a robust enough culture, even a terrible politics can't extinguish that. Whereas we can devote all of our energies to trying to sort of shore up the liberal system, and in the meantime lose the culture, and lose it ourselves, and lose it for our children. And so I would say, given the shortness of time and the need to focus on certain things, I would urge people who are interested in these debates to think much harder about what it is to sustain over a long period of time, regardless of what the political state looks like, to sustain a kind of culture that can bring us through whatever the blows that politics may put in front of us.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed your chapter on education, which I think is sort of feeding into a lot of what you're saying here, because the way you lay out the reduction of the humanities, both in the way they're taught, the number of students who want to major in them, and sort of the ways in which we attempt to justify teaching them now. I thought, in a way, that was the best opening for me to your book, because it did seem that this sort of way of thinking about liberty as expression and autonomy really struggles to make sense of, why would you struggle to read Aristotle? Or why would you try and read Augustine's Confessions in Latin? If this is the way, if we don't take this cultivation of liberty and virtue seriously, we just take into account a freedom from nature. I thought, in a way, it opened up for me why things have happened the way they've happened.
I really appreciate you pointing to that chapter and talking about it, and stressing the importance of that chapter, because I think in all of the discussions, and I've had many discussions of the book with radio interviewers and so forth, I don't think a single person so far has mentioned that chapter. I think it sort of reveals to me in some ways the truth of what I'm arguing, or at least suggests that the accuracy of what I'm describing, that everyone wants to talk about the politics and to focus on the kind of question of the state and the nature of liberalism as a political order. When actually I agree with that. I think that the focus on education is just so central and so key. This is the formation of the next generation. And so what is it that we are in some ways devoted to, or what are we saying are the most important things that the next generation has to take from us? And the fact that the liberal arts are dying around the country and around the world, with less, I think here conservatives have tended to be, at least historically, they fought for the liberal arts, but I see a kind of waning of those efforts as there's been an increasing embrace simply of STEM, training of STEM. And part of that is because I think they see the humanities largely as a lost cause, and I can't disagree with a lot of that analysis. But on the other hand, if we don't keep a core commitment to the idea of what the liberal arts really are, which is a training in liberty, it's the learning of the arts of liberty, then it seems to me that we just create, we really do by default create a servile education, an education for people who are trained in some ways to be servants, and servants now increasingly to an economic order in which they claim to be free, but which increasingly is really just oriented toward turning us into sort of drudge drones in order for us to fulfill our appetites. And this would be the very opposite of what, in the classical understanding, constitutes liberty.
Father Shaw said, for a modern democracy to completely remove itself from the liberal arts would be the opening to barbarism.
Yeah. Well,
and I will
never contradict anything that Father Shaw says.
No, I've thought about that. It does seem. A practical thing is we need to break the logjam in terms of how much it costs to be educated in the humanities. It costs a lot to receive a math degree or a biology degree or something like that. But it seems to me it should be a process much more open, and I think some efforts in that regard are needed. One could see sort of startup universities. I think possibly you would have to forego the accreditation route and just sort of offer yourself and make yourself open to that process, and then you could incorporate and draw on resources of the community. You could do science requirements obviously at a community college, but you could have sort of the core in-house, and there are a glut of PhDs you could hire to do this, to just be teachers and not those also who think they must publish a lot. And so I don't know, I've been thinking outside the box, and then if you put that together with sort of the rising, thinking there's 7 classical schools now just in Indianapolis. You think of all those students where, if this continues, you could have you create your own market. I don't know.
I think that's right. Look, I think the whole higher education system is fundamentally unsustainable. It's its own bubble right now. And most of these schools recognize this, and they feel like there's very little they can do. They're trapped in these processes that they themselves have sort of agreed to sign on to, and I do think there's going to be a tremendous opening for some really creative and I think potentially very exciting possibilities in higher education. But you're right. It's right now it is kind of a logjam, partly because for the time being, the prestige associated with attending a certain strata of universities still seems to be the ticket into the upper middle class in America. So I think, short of giving up on those institutions, I teach in one of those, and in our own ways, we're trying to sustain and indeed to develop and draw many students into just now what would be a kind of option within a liberal arts option within the larger university. And what we find at a place like Notre Dame, and I've found this everywhere I've taught, Georgetown and Princeton, is there is a profound hunger among many of our students who believe that they're in some ways being deprived of a birthright by being sort of directed away from an encounter with the deepest questions that every human life seems to desire to confront and to contemplate. And given the opportunity, they just flock to those opportunities. But one needs as best one can to keep alive those possibilities, even when within institutions that are otherwise increasingly both morally and increasingly literally bankrupt.
Yeah. Yeah, no. Well, Patrick, maybe we can end on that. Thank you so much for coming on and discussing why liberalism failed. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Richard. This was terrific. Thank you for having me.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.